Thank you everyone for coming out for the February edition of Movie Night. As you all know, I'm Mike DeLuca.
I'm Pam Abdi.
This is our expression of movie love across the studio. This is a chance for us to share films from our library that have inspired filmmakers that have made films with us, and a chance to give back to everybody who works so hard at the studio, and just kind of enjoy a night of very issue-free, drama-free, just movie love. And we're so excited tonight to have Christopher Nolan joining us. I mean, we don't even need you to say Memento, Inception, Prestige, Insomnia, the superhero movies, I forgot what they were called. Tenet. This man is not just a national treasure, he's a global treasure. Tireless defender of cinema as an art form and cinema as a big screen experience. We were so lucky, Pam and I, to recently be invited by Chris to experience Tenet in his preferred IMAX theater, at Universal, in the seats that are the best to sit in to experience, the artistry of that movie. And every time I think of Christopher Nolan, I literally think of, we're always having this debate about, what is cinema, what is a movie, streaming movies versus theatrical. Pam and I actually don't think it's versus, it's, both coexist. They're just two different art forms. They're two different mediums. I always think of the Lumiere brothers in 1895. The very first screening of a commercial film came with an audience. It wasn't like one Lumiere brother putting up a bed sheet in his room and showing it to the other brother. They solicited an audience. The medium was born with an audience. It's just not cinema if there's no audience. It's something else. It's not better or worse. It's just a different art form, and no one has been a bigger defender of that than Chris Nolan. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
No, thank you.
So Chris, why did you select Chariots of Fire?
I selected Chariots of Fire because, very sadly, we lost Hugh Hudson, who directed this great film a few weeks back. And I knew that Warner Brothers had domestic rights on Chariots of Fire and took it all the way to winning Best Picture at the Oscars in 1981. And for me, Chariots of Fire is one of those films who has been something of a victim of its own success. When it came out, it was an unexpected hit on a massive scale. And it got into the culture, got into the zeitgeist in that way that the biggest films do. And then over time, it sort of became absorbed by the establishment in a way, and so it becomes sort of less fashionable, less hip. But so for people like me, I was 11 years old when I first saw it. And then when I was sort of getting into films and looking at what filmmakers I admired and everything, it wasn't very high on my list because it really was very much the establishment of the British film industry, and it was a respectable film. I really came back to it when I was making The Prestige, because we were looking for precedents. Really, we were looking for films that had dual protagonists. That is to say, they're driven by two people in something of a rivalry, where it's not a buddy movie. Their characters operating in parallel come into interactions at different points in the story, and there were no precedents that we could find really other than Chariots of Fire. So I watched it again and I realized that it's a film. I mean, I don't want to say too much defining about the film before you're about to see it, but it's a film that, not unlike Lawrence of Arabia, I think, it's accepted, and the iconography is accepted as a literal representation of the thing that it's actually criticizing. So when you watch the film again, it's a very, very subversive movie. It's very anti-establishment. It's questioning a lot of the things that weirdly the establishment wrapped it up and absorbed its iconography and made it this part of sort of Britishness and empire and whatever. And that's not at all. The film was written by Colin Welland, who's a very adventurous writer. It has a very, very, as I say, anti-establishment or subversive element to it. I think Lindsay Anderson, appearing in the film, if for example, there's
Lucky Man too.
Yeah, exactly. There's an undercurrent of defiant subversiveness that got immediately embraced and squashed, and squeezed out of the thing. And so, for that reason, I found myself coming up with so much more respect for it. I mean, the things about the film, there's a long list of things about the film that were very, very defining and adventurous at the time. But top of the list to me is this idea of dual protagonists. And if you look at, this studio in particular, since then, won Best Picture for Chariots 5 and won Best Picture for The Departed. The structure then informed my own Prestige, Michael Mann's Heat, neither of which won Best Picture, sadly. but
were pretty good movies.
Yeah.
I can't speak for my own, but Heat, I think, is one of the modern masterpieces. And really, this film is a precedent. There are no machine guns.
I guess Amadeus a little bit too with the Mozart and Salieri characters.
Yeah, that's the thing. Mozart and Salieri obviously a little more antagonistic, which, in a sense is Heat, in a sense is The Departed. But yeah, I think as one of the jumping off points for that type of narrative, it's hard to beat this movie. It's hard to imagine it as a pitch to a studio head in terms of how that construction would work, which is what drove us to it when we were trying to explain the form of Prestige.
What about the film that left the biggest impression on you?
I think when I originally saw it, the thing that left the biggest impression was the music. It's one of the first films, it's really the first film I know of that used such an aggressive, anachronistic approach. It was a modern, very, very current score by Vangelis on a period film with no reason or explanation, no irony. There've been other movies that had sort of used anachronistic music in an ironic sense, but it's really, I think, the first of its kind, and now that's become an accepted tool for filmmakers. Nobody really questions the idea that you could use the most modern scoring methods, no matter what the period the film is set in. It won the Oscar for Best Score. It was an immediate piano bar.
Incredibly influential score.
Incredibly influential. And then, of course, as with so much about this film, fell out of fashion through ubiquity. It became it literally became the ammunition of lounge piano players everywhere and all that. And Vangelis' next score, which was Blade Runner, has become the better thought of. But I think when you look back at the history and you look back at the relationship of image to music, I think this is the more defining of his work.
So iconic.
Yeah, absolutely iconic and became absolutely symbolic of sports, of athletic achievement, of the Olympics, all of these things.
Yeah, it was inspiring. It kept people moving. Literally.
Yeah.
How has the film influenced you as a filmmaker?
Well, I think really the first two things we were talking about most specifically, I certainly found it liberating from a scoring point of view to really feel free to work with composers, in the sense of saying everything's on the table. We can use the orchestra, we can use synthesizers, we can combine them, what have you, no matter what the period or what the particular subject matter. I think also, I do think the structure is inspiring, the daring nature of the structure. That's something that sticks with me. It's also a film that really had no stars, had great actors, and so it serves as inspiration that, yes, it got held up as a very mainstream hit, but it was incredibly unlikely, and it's hard to remember how unlikely a hit it was.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons, we're showing it on a film print as it was, unrestored, just the way audiences were seeing it at the time. And
Very pure tonight.
yeah, very pure, and it was a surprise for audiences at the time, and a wonderful surprise for them to discover.
Pam and I feel so blessed and lucky to be at Warner Brothers with this incredible legacy of filmmaking, and nobody has contributed more to that legacy than Chris Nolan and his body of work here at the studio. Putting recent history aside, what are the benefits of having a home base or having a studio to return to, with each successive movie? Is the familiarity a strength in your process, or was it a strength in your process as each film kind of took life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people here are people we've worked with for years, and having a familiarity with
Is Jeff Goldstein in the audience?
Jeff. Sure.
All right.
There he is. And
Mark Scoop.
Yeah, Mark's there.
and many others, I'm sure. Yeah, having familiar faces, having people that you understand how they work, how they can maybe maximize the effort that we're making on the production sense, very important. I mean, I think the culture of the studio is an incredible asset for a film.
So important. And how do you feel, what's your opinion, given what a champion you are of the current state of theatrical movie going, or, I know it's hard to predict the future, but what, from your vantage point, how do you think things are going? Where do you think things are going?
Well, I think all the most recent developments are very positive. I mean, obviously COVID was an unprecedented setback for so many industries, theatrical notwithstanding, but, we released theatrically, I want to say, I mean, Jeff will shut me down if I get it wrong, but I think it's 63% of the 2019 movies numerically were released last year, did 65% of the box office. Mm-hmm. So the individual titles are performing in a very healthy fashion. The signs are all good for return, and there's been a welcome change in the culture of Wall Street that's now looking at profitability again, which as a filmmaker coming to the studio system, the idea that you would want that is a little counterintuitive.
Right.
Of course, what we found is when the goalposts got moved and the rules got changed in terms of, okay, how do you define success? With theatrical film, if you don't define it through profitability, it becomes a little amorphous, and then decisions get made for reasons you can't necessarily understand. But I think things look good for theatrical and for the relationship between theatrical and streaming. I think it's set to be a very productive business relationship, as opposed to the artificial rivalry that was kind of forced on it in the early days.
That's what I think too,
agree.
yeah.
Not unlike, actually, when this film came out, it was one of the first films, I first saw this film on VHS. And it really was that moment where VHS came along, well, it was Betamax and VHS at the time. They were
duking it out.
They were duking it out, and they were both going to destroy theatrical. And as it turned out, they did not destroy theatrical, they paid for theatrical. They gave it an absolutely the next evolution of life, and I think we're in a very similar moment now.
No, I was just gonna say, I'm optimistic about where we're going theatrically. I feel like you're right, it was artificially said when the pandemic hit, people were just saying it's over, but Mike and I talk about it all the time. It's like, we're conditioned as human beings to want to experience things communally and to talk about it afterwards, and to sit in a theater, there's nothing like it, to sit in the theater, to laugh or to cry, or to walk out of the theater and go to the diner and talk about it, talk about a film afterwards, or go to school on Monday, or go to your work on Monday. There's just nothing like it. So I just think
I agree.
You're right.
Nicole Kidman couldn't have said it better.
She couldn't have said it.
It's magic.
I want to be in the next Adam Aarons AMC commercial, Jeff. Can you make that happen? I think the three of us should do it.
Well, we're going to see Adam in CinemaCon.
We're going to pitch
put our
it
audition tape in. Since you're here, I have to ask, and if you could share with the group, what drew you, since it's next for you, what drew you to the subject of Oppenheimer? What was that something you had wanted to make for a long time?
Yeah, well, we don't come out till July, so I don't have my pitch figured out. It's a good chance to explore it a little bit. No, I mean, those of you who worked on Tenet know that there's a reference to Oppenheimer in that film, and it speaks to the hook of what I find extraordinary about that story, which is just this notion of there being a moment where they can test the first atomic device, and they had calculations that suggested there might be a very small possibility that they would set fire to the atmosphere and destroy the world. And they went ahead and pushed the button anyway. I thought, what a remarkable moment, what a room to be in.
Yeah, I mean, that whole theme, the Prometheus theme, taking fire from the gods, it's so profound.
Yeah.
And something we're facing, unfortunately on a continuing basis in the world we live in. Yeah. Chris has graciously agreed to answer any questions, if anything comes up for anybody in the audience.
I didn't say any question.
Well, some appropriate questions.
Yes.